Now, here's a question. As a Christian, what would you say is the most important thing we should do? As a Christian, what would you say is the most important thing we should do? Now, the more we think about that question, the more potentially controversial it becomes. Some of us might say, echoing the words of what we've already said in our service this morning so far, the words of Jesus, the greatest commandment is this: love God, love neighbor. But others might say, what did Jesus say in John? A new commandment I give you, love one another. Hang on, someone else might say, wait a minute. What about what's often called the Great Commission? Go into the world and make disciples. And we could go on and on and on, debating what is the most important thing that we should do as Christians. I wonder what was first in your mind as you thought about that. Now, as I was preparing for this morning, I suddenly realized, having laid out the question, I guess that I'm somewhat duty bound to have a go at trying to answer it. And today, as we brought forward from next week into today, we celebrate the birth of John the Baptist. What I'd like to do is just to suggest that our reading from Luke's Gospel, recording there for us the birth and naming of John. In fact, it tells us a little bit more about the family situation, but it goes some way, I'd like to suggest, in helping us to explore this question as we look not so much at John, but at his parents and at the wider family and community. For today, as we remember the birth of John, it's not simply about us remembering an historical event that just encourages us simply to look back. Rather, it's about our remembering, and it encourages us, or should encourage us, not only to look forward and upward, but also to look inward. And what we'll see as we try to do this, and as we ponder the question, so what is the most important thing? What we'll see is that Luke helps us to look beyond our doing and to look not only inward toward our motivation, why are we doing what we do, but also to look upward and to see again who it is who's asking, but also to look forward to see the potential and the possible. And as we do this, so we'll see, I hope, that Luke suggests through this record of John's birth that first and foremost, our answer to that question is one that focuses upon our quality and character. And I'd like to suggest we see a number, and I'm sure if you look at it, you'll find plenty more, a number of qualities or characteristics, which although they sit below the surface in this account of Luke's, we'll see that they are fundamentally important. And as we do this, I'd like to highlight just three things. I'm sure, as I've just said, you'll find more, but three things. What's the most important thing that we should be doing as Christians? Well, I'd like to suggest that the first characteristic we see is that of obedience. We are to obey God. Now, today, this is a word that doesn't really curry much favor amongst society in general. We don't like being told we've got to do something. Somehow it carries with it an undertone of a power dynamic, of control or abuse. You should or you must do this. We tell ourselves that we're free, we're independent people, we're able to make our own choices, demanding even that we make our own choices. And so we rebel against this word, obey. And yet, as we look at our reading, so we see how Zechariah obeys God. Now, if you know the story, you'll know that initially Zechariah doubts God, and so he is struck dumb. But here, now, we see his obedience to God. And he is obedient in spite of family and community pressure. Everyone else says the boy should be called Zechariah after his father. Elizabeth says no, so they ask Zechariah, and he says no, his name is John. Zechariah is obedient to God. We might know, or we might have our own idea as to what is the most important thing. But are we obedient? Did you know 97% of the world has heard of Coca-Cola? 72% of the world has seen a can or a bottle of Coca-Cola. 51% of the world has tasted Coca-Cola. And yet Coca-Cola has only been around since 1886, 136 years. And someone made this comment: if God had given the task of world evangelization to Coca-Cola, it probably would have been finished by now. Are we obedient? In the book of 1 Samuel, and we touched upon it in another of our readings, God says to Saul, does the Lord really want your sacrifices and your offerings? No, he doesn't want your sacrifices. He wants you to obey him. So the first characteristic or quality that we see that is important is obedience. The second we see is that of faith. John the Baptist's birth was the fulfillment of a promise, not just to Elizabeth and Zechariah, that they were to have a son, where we see in chapter 1, the angel says to Elizabeth and Zechariah, he will be a joy and a delight to you. But we see that John was also the fulfillment of a promise to all people. As the angel says, many will rejoice because of his birth. And as we see in the words of the prophet Isaiah that Ray read for us, he will prepare the way for the Lord. And we see how Zechariah, we've said already, simply didn't believe that. He doubts that. And so he is struck dumb. But now at John's birth, we see faith. And again, thinking of our question, we might all have our own ideas as to what is the most important thing. But what is it that God is saying to you today? What's God saying to you? And do we really believe God can? Or do we, like Zechariah at the beginning, do we doubt? Second quality or characteristic, faith. And then finally, the third characteristic we see is that of expectation. I wonder, and it was a challenge to me as I was preparing, I wonder, do we ever expect that God might just do something? Do we ever expect that God might just do something? Or are we like the board meeting of the company that was involved in door-to-door sales of Bibles? And there they were, this group of sort of 3 or 4 men, and they were recruiting people to do door-to-door sales of Bibles. And there was a man who had applied, and when he turned up and they were interviewing him, they realized he had an exceptionally bad stutter. Well, the interview panel, after hearing this, said to him, "We're really sorry. There is no way that you can do a job like this with a stutter like that." And the man replied, "Please, just give me a chance." Well, this group of men, they asked him to leave the room so that they could discuss it. And when he'd gone, one of them, feeling sorry for the chap, said, "I've got an idea. Let's just give him 50 Bibles and leave him to it. It'll take him years to sell them." So that's what they did. They called him back in and they said, "This is what we'll do." Anyway, 2 or 3 days later, the man came back and he said, "Can I have some more Bibles? I've sold all of those." Well, these 4 guys were just completely amazed. And they asked him to explain how had he done that with a stutter like his. And the man said, "It's easy. I just asked people on the doorstep, would you like to buy a Bible or would you like me to read it to you?" Expectation. And as we look at the birth of John, we see this sense of expectation, not just held by Elizabeth and Zechariah, who knew the angel's promise, but we also see it echoed through the words of the crowd, who would have known something of God's promise through Isaiah, and so they are expectant. They're asking themselves, what then is this child going to be? And as we read that account from Luke, we see a real sense of expectation. God is on the move. He's about to do something. And the people, they sensed it and they wanted to be part of it. So often today, if we're honest, and I speak to myself, if we're honest, we can have what so often appears to be a low, if almost no, real sense of expectation, to the extent that if we think about it at all, we really don't expect that God can or will do anything. So coming back to where we started, our question, what's the most important thing that we should do as Christians? What's the most important thing we should do as Christians? From our little exploration through Luke's account of the birth of John the Baptist, 3 things. Obey the Lord your God. trust that he will fulfill his promise, and have a genuine sense of expectation that God can. Amen.